Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another webinar from the TUC. I'm Anna. It's good to be back after the summer. I'm joined by three guests today who I'll introduce in a second, but I'm going to do our usual webinar housekeeping first up. As always, we've got live captions on this webinar. Below the video stream, there's a green button that says live captions. If you click that, the captions will open in a new window for you to follow along with the speech as we're talking. As ever, we've got the chat panel on the right-hand side of the screen. Please use that to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, ask any questions of each other, and exchange tips, ideas, and tell us about your experiences of today's subject, which is employment charters. So my colleagues, Jay, Jawad and Abigail will also be there in the chat, posting links to resources and to any links that you might find useful. We are, of course, recording the webinar because we know that some of you like to watch these back. We will make the webinar recording available to all of you later today, along with any of the resources that we share. So don't worry if you miss something or you've got to leave early, we'll make sure you get a copy of the recording. We've also got an opportunity for you to ask our panel questions. So on the right-hand side, there's an icon that looks like a speech bubble with a question mark in it. If you click on that, it opens the question and answer panel. It says Q&A. You can type your questions there for the panel, and we'll get to those after they've answered my questions about employment charters. Please don't worry if we don't get to every question, because we do use all questions that you put to us in these webinars to inform information that we put out to our workplace reps. So all questions are important. Okay, so today's session is about employment charters. What are they and how are they helpful in the workplace to make a difference for union members by you as union reps? And we've got three great speakers to tell us about this today. We've got Peter Dickinson, who's from the University of Warwick. Now, Peter and colleagues have done a lot of research on employment charters, so I've got some questions to put to him about that research. We've also got Rachel Williamson from the Greater London Authority. Rachel was involved in the work on the Good Work Standard across London, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about that from her. And then we've got Peter Irwin from UNISON. And Peter has been involved in the development and implementation of employment charters in Liverpool and Greater Manchester. So I'm sure you'll hear lots more about that experience once we get going. So the first set of questions is going to go to Peter Dickinson. So first up, Peter, what from your work is an employment charter? Please tell us some more about them.
Right, can you hear me okay?
All good.
Employment charters are a form of soft regulation. So the work that I've done has looked at the Good Work Charters of Mayoral Combined Authority. And unlike the devolved governments, combined authorities don't have any powers over employment laws. So the primary aim for them is to shape, as opposed to regulating or legislating for employment practices. And there's two stages to that. One is reminding employers of what their statutory responsibilities are, or what minimum practice would look like across the dimensions of good work. And then to encourage employers to go beyond them, the obligations to voluntarily operate good or better employment practices. But there's a range of employment charters out there, and I suppose they're what you want them to be. So in terms of the existing other charters, there's one that looks at particular labour market groups. So Business in the Community's Rates at Work Charter, the Disability Employment Charter. They exist in specific local authority areas. So before the combined authorities, there were Good Work Charters in Birmingham and Salford. They look at specific dimensions of good work, especially the living wage foundations, work on the real living wage, and also the workplace wellbeing charters. So there's quite a range of charters out there.
Thanks for that, Peter. So you've talked about the range of charters and the different areas of the country where we're seeing them at the moment. And we will hear a little bit more from Rachel about the one in London shortly. But have you noticed any common themes or differences in the charters through your work so far?
The charters are relatively new, and so the first ones were launched in London and Manchester in 2019, and the later ones are a debt of gratitude to them. And because there's a lot of cross combined authority working on the charters, then there's a lot of similarity between them. So in terms of the dimensions that they cover, then they cover a similar range of dimensions. So things like pay, representation, well-being, equality and diversity, for example. But they all emerge out of a wide consultative effort. The main stakeholders, trade unions, employer organisations, public sector organisations, and organisations like CIPD and ACAS. And so they emerge out of these consultations, and they reflect the profile and nuances of the labour markets in their respective areas. So there's important similarities, but also important differences. The other similarity that they have is that they have different levels of sign-up. So they all have for want of a better term, a foundation level, and that's usually just the basic legal requirements that employers can sign up to. And that's really to have an initial step that all employers could sign up to, especially smaller employers who don't have the internal HR resources to administer or manage the charter, or in sectors like hospitality that have to go a further distance to meet them. But then you've got a higher level. So the intention is that you have this initial engagement step and then support employees to higher levels of work standards.
Thanks, Peter. So you mentioned a couple of the sectors there where we might see these charters. Can you tell us maybe 2 or 3 other sectors? You mentioned hospitality. What other sectors might we see these in?
Well, I think in terms of the level of sign up amongst the cross-sector charters, then you get the sign up of larger organisations and employers in things like professional business services that have less distance to travel. And so it's more of a challenge to get other sectors to sign up to them. So what some combined authorities have done is to try and promote the charters amongst those sectors where they undertake a lot of their work, where a lot of their funding goes. So, for example, Greater London Authority does a lot of work promoting tourism, so they're promoting the charters within those sectors. I mean, generally, their charters are across either all employers or within specific groups like disability or Black and minority ethnic groups, so on and so forth, or focusing on a specific dimension like pay or well-being.
Thanks, Peter. So have the charters that we've got at the moment made a difference so far? And if so, what have those differences been?
So the first ones were launched in 2019, and then of course we had the pandemic. So it's relatively early days, and only Greater Manchester has undertaken an evaluation of their charters. In terms of the number of employers, then in any area, they're quite small, but they tend to be larger employers. So the proportion of workers in a local labour market is a lot higher than employers that have signed up to it. We've recently done some work on looking at the way that local authorities use their procurement processes to achieve good work standards, and we looked at those in different areas, and one of which was Greater Manchester. And what we found was that having these charters at the combined authority level generates a lot of strategic coherence across the local authorities. So other organisations within that area, when they're linking procurement to trying to achieve good work standards, you've got the Greater Manchester Good Work Charter, which they can refer to, and if they're developing their own, then it's sort of more straightforward for them to identify the work needed. And also there's a lot more support for employers on the Greater Manchester Charter website as well. So I think the main impact is that strategic coherence within a particular area.
Thanks, Peter. And I think some of those differences you've highlighted can be opportunities going forward for the development of further charters. So thank you for that. We'll come back to you soon with some further questions. But before I move on to Rachel, I've got a question for the audience. When you signed up to this webinar, we asked you if you'd been involved in a charter at any point. What I want to know now is, in your workplace, is there a charter? Would you know if there's charter? How do you know? Tell us what's going on in your workplace and what your employer maybe has said about these. So we're going to move on to Rachel next. So as I said, Rachel has joined us from the Greater London Authority. And so my first question for Rachel is, why has the GLA launched a good work standard, and where did the idea come from?
Yeah, so this was a key manifesto commitment for the Mayor back in 2016. And he said he would work with employers and trade unions to raise the quality of employment in London. And the main idea of it was to recognise and to promote good practice in employment, and for businesses to share that with other businesses. But in doing so, beneath that, the key aim is to tackle some of the key challenges in London's labour market. So things like lack of adequate workplace rights, low pay, and particularly for this Mayor of London, that would look at pay below the real living wage rate, discrimination in the labour market and persistent pay gaps, unemployment and underemployment. So particularly looking at Black and minority ethnic Londoners, women with children, lone parents, and then also tackling, high levels of poverty, in work poverty, and financial distress. I'd just flag as well, sorry, that the Mayor is a significant employer in London. If you look across the Greater London Authority family, so the Mayor also was very keen through this to lead by example, and also to promote good work in the supply chain, which again is a really significant lever. So he spends some £11 billion across the GLA family.
Exactly the same, like leading by example with the charter. So when you were developing the Good Work Standard, how did you decide what should be included in it, and why were some things included but others not?
Yeah, so it was quite a lengthy and sort of iterative process. So it started with a call for evidence back in 2017, and was really developed in collaboration with trade unions, employers, the professional bodies, so employer associations, people like the CIPD, ACAS. And, our records are that, some 250 people perhaps participated in that development process. And then, we went through a call for evidence, we went through a series of roundtables, a number of drafts were developed and shared and commented on, and then we trialled it with a number of organisations, and we effectively relaunched with their support in the summer of 2019. That includes some trade unions, and we also at that point had TUC and UNISON as accredited Good Work Standard employers themselves. I mean, the call for evidence did go out with some initial ideas, so some things that were really important to the Mayor of London. He said that, you know, he really wanted to see fair pay and conditions, you know, at central, and also for the real living wage to be a minimum. So that sort of links up with his role in being a real champion of the London living wage, but also the you know, the fact that London as a world city has particularly high costs of living. He also was really clear that we should take action against exploitative terms and conditions. So, for example, inappropriate use of 0 hours contracts. And then the call for evidence suggested some other areas where we really gathered lots of views. So employee voice, working with trade unions, embedding diversity and inclusion. So again, you know, London is a world city with hyper diversity. That is a core pillar to the London approach. So that was in there. Flexible working, health and wellbeing, financial wellbeing, routes into employment for young Londoners, and lifelong learning. And, you know, essentially we had to come to a consensus view. So we wanted lots of good progressive practices in there, but we also needed a practical scheme. And I suppose we're also recognising the barriers that some smaller businesses might face in meeting any benchmark, you know, where that required a certain capacity, such as an HR team. So we were going for a broad scheme, but one that sort of spoke to the particularities of London, and we did make some design decisions along the way. So, you know, we had to think about how to group certain criteria so that the scheme was easy to understand and didn't look and feel overly complicated for a business. And we arrived at these 4 pillars of good work. And then we were really keen to engage a really wide range of employers, including those who perhaps weren't at the level to begin with, but wanted to improve their practice over time. So we came to the 3 tiers: foundation, achievement, and excellence. And then again, we had to think about how we'd make sure it was robust and had teeth. So the scheme had to be, you know, a good level of stretch even for good employers. You know, the criteria in there are quite specific, so there isn't too much wiggle room. And we asked for evidence from employers so that they could demonstrate that they were doing what they say they were.
Thanks, Rachel. You've just answered another question that formed in my head while you were speaking, which was, you know, did employers just say, yeah, we're doing this, but you said no, they had to evidence it. So maybe we'll come back to some of the evidence issues a bit later. So everything you've said sounds great about the Good Work Standard, but I can imagine that there have been challenges in introducing it. What have some of those challenges been, and how did you get around them?
Yeah. So I joined the Greater London Authority in 2019. So I've really been specifically involved in the delivery of the scheme. So I can speak a bit more directly to that. But obviously in the 2 years prior to that, in the sort of conceiving and developing of the scheme, there were some really, important discussions and some challenges to overcome. And I think Greater Manchester have described that process really well in a toolkit they've done with Manchester Met University. You know, things like narrowing the scope, navigating debate and conflicting views, and achieving that balance between breadth and scope, and speaking to different types of employers, and having a practical initiative that can be delivered. But if I speak to the bit that's really about implementation, I'd say that there's been sort of 3 key challenges. One is engaging employers in what is quite a crowded landscape in terms of good employment practice initiatives. Some are paid for, some aren't. You know, the London scheme and all the other local combined authority led schemes that are free. But we have to think about how we stand out. How can we really connect with employers, sell to them the value of getting involved. And what's worked well for us is using the mayor's leadership and his convening power. So he raises this when he's speaking with employers. That does help. what has also worked has been thinking about our connections on our networks to other things that we do at the Greater London Authority. So, for example, we have skills funding devolved in London. We're pushing out good work standards throughout our skills supply chain, or we're trying to bring on board those employers who are working with us on diversity and inclusion initiatives. We're also working with trade union colleagues. We meet every 2 months to coordinate engagement with priority employers or in priority sectors. Secondly, on engagement, I'd add, even once you've got an employer signed up, thinking about how we keep that engagement and add value. And it's been really important to us to have a range of really visible, ongoing activities that involve organisations with the good work agenda. So, for example, we try and make sure we've got a good programme of events to promote aspects of good work. So this autumn, we've got a session on working with a trade union, staff-led networks, diversity in the workplace. We really need to add value to our community, I think, to keep them remembering and prioritising this. And then thirdly, I just flag that, we do need capacity to support and nudge employers as they improve their practice over time. Sometimes we find we're engaging with an employer really for a number of months before they meet the benchmark. We've got a team of 5 working on the Good Work Standard in London, but, we find there's still always more to do. And we aren't HR specialists, but we collect examples of good practice and we signpost through to expert support that's available out there in other organisations.
Thanks, Rachel. So my next question, is more about the impact of this. What difference is this standard making, not just to employers, but to employees and people who work at organisations that have got this good work standard? What does it mean for them, and how does it improve their working life?
So when an organisation becomes an accredited employer, we ask them to communicate that really clearly to their workforce. So from our perspective, it's really important that the employees know that their employer has been recognised as a good work standard. So if anything, isn't at the level they'd expect it to be, then they can speak to their employer, they speak to their trade union, they can speak to us at the GLA, and for us, it's really important that there's that that good awareness of the scheme, so that we can hold each other to account. But we are seeing employers improve their practice over time, and this is really where the policy makes a difference. So when people put in their submission, we know often they've been working with us for a number of months. We know the things that they've changed in their policies and practice, and there's usually a good number of things that they've done differently. And one thing that HR professionals or business founders that we deal with tell us is that they find the good work standard as a really sort of helpful and practical list for them in thinking about what changes, what improvements they can make next. We've also embedded the real living wage in the London scheme, so that means that low wage Londoners are getting an annual pay rise, and we often see, as a result of engagement with the good work standard, an employer going through that living wage accreditation process. So, for example, we actually know how many low pay workers are getting extra money in their pockets as a result of engaging with the good work agenda. And we're in touch with our good work standard community. We try to provide relevant events. We try to provide the tools and the guidance that they need, and they tell us that is useful and helpful. Indeed, if you're in an organisation pushing good work, sometimes people tell us that can be a bit lonely, and what people have got, what the HR professional or the business founder has got, is a community, I guess, of others who are pushing this agenda in their organisation. And again, I think that makes a difference.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. So just a quick question before we move on to Peter Irwin. This is a question from me. Do some employers progress through the 3 levels you've mentioned of the good work standard? They might get their first level accreditation at the stage 1 and they do move up to stage 3.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the foundation level really is those basic and legal requirements. So we're not really congratulating anyone for getting to that. But what it is a really great way of getting people engaged. It means we're in touch with them. It means we can share with them information about events that are coming up. We can also, just keep up that conversation and nudge them to go further and try and improve over time. But yeah, once they meet the achievement level, absolutely, we see that people get that competitive edge and they want to get to the next level. And we have organisations that have put in a submission for achievement, give it a year or so, 18 months, they've come back around again and they've put in a submission for excellence. And yeah, that's what this policy should be about, is about people improving their practice over time. And that's what we want to see.
Thanks, Rachel. So now our final panel speaker, Peter Irwin, who's here to give us the union perspective on this. So first question for you, Peter. Why and how did Unison get involved in the employment charters scheme in Greater Manchester and Liverpool? Can you talk a bit about your involvement in that, please?
Yes, thanks, Anna. I suppose it was an easy decision for us, because if there's going to be employment charters in the North West, then we want them to be good and we want them to reflect the wishes of our members. And it was consistently expressed by our activists that they wanted charters that have teeth. We didn't want them just to be patting employers on the back for what they're already doing. So for that to be the case, we really did need to be involved. I think another part of it, is that these charters are linked to city regions. They're not free floating. They're linked to specific places. They were born, as in London, of manifesto commitments by then candidates to become mayors. So there's sort of an electoral and democratic aspect to these charters. And they operate on a level that's been vacant for decades, really, since the 80s. We haven't had authorities covering Greater London, Greater Manchester, Merseyside, and so on. So I think part of it as well is that we're keen to see what can be done to improve employment standards on that scale of governance, and this is an opportunity to do that. In terms of how we're involved, it's been a matter, first of all, it was mentioned about a call for evidence and so on. So we were very much engaged stakeholders at the outset. So there were events, in-person events at the time, pre-COVID, where members and activists mobilised to attend. So we filled in the flip charts and so on, saying what sort of thing we might like. Then there was a period when there was lots of written consultations. So we put in detailed, quite thought through responses to those various consultations, which was quite a big job of work at the time. And branches were involved, sometimes submitting their own, sometimes commenting on a regional submission on those consultations. So I think we established ourselves as keen and engaged stakeholders, and perhaps partly because of that, we might have been invited anyway, but we were then involved in steering groups and what became the boards of the two Northwest charters, and then there's ongoing work in reporting back through the Northwest TUC, through Greater Manchester and Liverpool City Region branches, and making the best of what we can do in that arena, in those board meetings, and being on the inside really in policy making on employment in the city regions.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Peter. So from a union perspective, what were some of the challenges you found when you were designing and implementing these? We could argue that union reps in the workplace are all about making work better. So what advantage does the employment charter bring them?
Okay. I'll talk a bit about the rep role in this in a moment. But I mean, I think in terms of just on your first point around challenges, I think we certainly have had challenges, and I was reflecting on this, and I think a key tension in all of this is really about what the Charter's about. Is it about the creation and promotion of particular standards and holding employers to standards, which is nearer to what we're doing really with it? Or is it about primarily engagement, about basically because of the fact that it's a voluntary take-up charter, the employers have to be persuaded to be involved. And there's sometimes an emphasis on the importance of employer events and the employer network. And so sometimes you hear people say that good employment isn't a destination, it's a journey, and so on. So there's these two sort of concepts, and so there's a focus on standards and a focus on engagement. And I think in truth the Charter's going to be about both. But I think where a lot of the disagreements are is what's prioritised, what is it primarily about. So I've got a couple of examples from my dealings in Greater Manchester with the Charter.
Please share.
So one of them was back in January 2020. That's when the membership criteria were first published for the Charter, and they included something that we hadn't agreed to, which was a clause around how you could become a member of the Charter if you were trying to pay the living wage, if you're doing all you could to pay it. Now, we got that changed, and nobody's ever been accredited to the GM Charter as a member who isn't paying the living wage. So we managed to change it. But the motivation for that was interesting because they had in mind a firm in a difficult sector, in the security industry, that was good on all the other aspects of employment, was really exemplary, but said it just can't pay the living wage. We would if we could, but we can't due to the sector that we're in and the commissioning arrangement. So I think that at an early stage really led to a philosophical discussion about what it is really. And I think we held the line that it's a good employment charter about standards that are universal really of what good employment is for workers, rather than it being sort of a well-meaning employer charter rewarding employers for doing the best they can, perhaps in difficult circumstances. So I think that was a key moment really in the development of the Charter. But it comes back again and again, that tension, because there's other sectors, construction more recently. We had an applicant who was good on all other measures, but wouldn't pay sick pay from day one of absence, which is a requirement for a member. Can we tweak it so they can be in? It would be great for the Charter if we broke into the construction industry. But again, we held the line on the standard. So this tension just crops up every so often, and it will never be resolved. But it's sort of the root of a lot of the discussions and disagreements on the board, I think.
Thanks, Peter. That's really interesting hearing about how you got around those challenges and those tensions. And yeah, great that you held the line on such important issues. Okay, again, from the union perspective, what are the opportunities for trade unions around employment charters? I know you've mentioned some of them already, but are there any others you'd like to add here?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's for unions as institutions, I think by being involved in it, you sort of we're cementing our place as being important stakeholders on issues around employment in the city region. So that's one thing. But we need to look at where do charters have an impact and have some material benefit to workers, to union members and to unions. And I think there's a couple of dynamics really. So at the point that an employer is trying to become accredited, when it's going through the assessment process, there's a chance there to exert leverage and for them to change some of the things they do in order to become a member. So I know that has happened. They often have to tighten up what they do on the living wage or on flexible working, or and often they have to say, at least make commitments around union access that they wouldn't willingly have made in other circumstances. So there's that. So you get a bit of a go at that point before they're accredited. But then after they're accredited, I think you get a second go because they're then on the record and they've had the mayor do the video saying that they're a member. So they're on the hook then for delivering on what they've said they do and what commitments they've made. So I think again at that point you've got a chance to improve things for workers and to make it reality if it isn't in some instances. One particular thing I'm thinking of is they'll sometimes make a commitment around trade union access in order to get membership of the Charter, and where that coincides with perhaps a target employer for a union, then that's something that can be followed up and then get an introduction and then get an in for discussing potential recognition. There's a few ways, I think, at different junctures where we can get something from the charters.
Yes, some great opportunities there, especially around the access to workplaces for unions. I think that's a really key one. So I think that a fair number of our audience today are workplace reps. So in what ways is this useful for them? Like if they, for example, if they know their employer isn't signed up to one of these charters, what would their first step be in taking this forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I was thinking, I sort of see the charter as a tool for reps, particularly after the point at which they've become accredited, in that it's things that they can hold them to. But it might be something that a rep could approach an employer about the advantages potentially to them in being part of it. Now that's so they, I mean, this is something that especially the Greater Manchester Charter does a very good job of doing in promoting the Charter to employers. They do have a network. They put on loads of events. They put on awards ceremonies, and so on. So there is, in a way, I don't know if it's our role as unions so much to be promoting charter membership. I almost think we don't need to so much, because there are people employed by these charters whose living is based on them growing. So I think charters have their own sort of dynamic in wanting to grow and to get more employers to engage.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that, Peter. Don't forget, anyone who's watching, you can post questions in the Q&A panel if you want to ask Peter, Rachel and Peter anything. I can see that some of you have been commenting in the chat, which is fantastic. And thank you, Peter Dickinson, for replying to some of those and giving more information. I think that's incredibly helpful. We have had a few questions that were sent in advance. So I'm going to put those to you all now. If I pick the wrong speaker to answer the question, just tell me and we can go to someone else. So first off, Rachel, I'm going to ask this for you. In the Greater London area, how would someone find out if their workplace is covered by an employment charter or not? 1 second, I just need to unmute your mic.
Hi. So we put online a list of everybody who has the Good Work Standard accreditation. So you can just do a quick check on the website to see if the employer's there. Equally, we do, with our trade union colleagues, have a list of those employers who we're targeting or encouraging to join the Good Work Standard. So through those representatives, we're also really pleased to get ideas of people we should be approaching. So I'd also encourage trade union colleagues to make connections with that with their rep and put forward suggestions for people that we should be reaching out to.
Thanks, Rachel. So that covers London, but Peter Dickinson, is there a kind of, say someone might not be aware whether there's one in their area, is there a way they can check? Is there a way that people can check, like on a national level, whether they live in an area where this is relevant, and then if their employer is signed up?
There's no national database of combined authorities or any other charters, so apart from Googling it, then it's very difficult to find out if you're if your employer is within a particular charter, be it combined authority or one of the other charters, but if an employer is signed up to one of these charters, then usually it's something that they want to advertise. As I mentioned in the past, one of the things coming out of the Greater Manchester evaluation was the employees wanting to look like good employees within their local labour markets, and that's a real advantage to them of signing up to the charters. That their position within their local area is important, and so if they do sign up to the charters, then it's something that they want to promote. Just on a point that Rachel said about how it's a crowded market, and one of the combined authorities set up a spreadsheet which identified if you were signed up to one charter, which dimensions of that combined authority charters they'd signed up to. So I think the support to employer dimension within the combined authorities charter is very important.
Thanks for that, Peter. Some helpful info there. Okay, if a rep knows their employer is signed up to a charter, but they know that, or they've noticed that the employer is only following some of it, or that they might have slipped, maybe they passed everything initially, but they've slipped in some of their standards, what could they do? I'll go to you first, Peter Irwin, and then maybe you, Rachel.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Yeah, so I mean, I think that what happens is that at the point when an employee becomes a member, they do get a little fanfare for doing so, and they might be concerned about the possibility of losing that that PR win, and it could be very embarrassing to have accreditation withdrawn from them. So that's the thing that might be in the back of their mind. So I think it's a matter for a rep to raise it and identify where they're failing to meet the criteria that they should be meeting. Now, if it comes to it, in truth, I'm not entirely confident that charters are likely to withdraw accreditations. They're not. I'd be interested in Rachel's thoughts on that and whether London have done that. But just knowing what to do about how they accredit employers, I think they'd be very reluctant to do it, because they're not in the game of trying to lose members, but also it might make other potential members of the charter nervous if they thought there's a chance of a big media storm about them then being disqualified from it. So I think in reality, I'm not sure how strong a lever that is for us to pull, but I think it's something to have in the background, probably something to threaten rather than to use, because I don't know if it's that usable. But I mean, a good employer who's got through all the process, if somebody brings to their attention that they're not meeting one of the standards, you'd hope and probably expect that they would be willing to listen to that and want to put it right without too much difficulty.
A related question before I go to Rachel is in the charters you were involved in, Peter, the Liverpool and Greater Manchester. Is there a kind of reassessment process, like maybe every year, every 2 years? Like, what happens?
Yeah, there is actually something I should have mentioned. There is a whistleblowing element in Greater Manchester. Liverpool's not as far on, they haven't had second tier accreditations yet, but Greater Manchester has. But there is a whistleblowing element as well that they do have within their structure. And they also, I think it's every 3 years. Nobody's been accredited long enough, although they'll just be getting there now. But there is supposed to be a revisit, I think, after 3 years.
Thanks, Peter. And my colleague Jay has just posted that in Greater Manchester, this is really helpful. Thank you, Jay. An employer no longer met the standards, so they're no longer a member. So that's how it works there. That's really helpful to hear. Okay, so Rachel, the same questions I put to Peter. The rep knows that the employer is only meeting some of the criteria, what could they do in London?
Yeah, I agree with everything Peter's just described. I mean, these are employers who are committed to good work. So, you know, within that, if they are become aware of something not being right, they should be, you know, through that commitment, putting it right pretty quick. But if there isn't if there is something that isn't right, absolutely, we want to know. So, you know, we do get representations through to the mayor or through to our team directly, that we get in touch with the employer about, investigate, and ultimately we'd like to see things put right again. But if there is an employer who's not meeting the mark, then they can't be a good work standard employer. And this is quite a live discussion, because trade union colleagues are working with us to go through our reaccreditation process. So we reaccredit employers every 4 years, and we're just coming up to that first batch of employers going through reaccreditation. You know, we have an annual check-in, but that's really about keeping up a conversation and understanding what the sort of live issues for the employer. But this is a resubmission, a relook at, and you know, depending on what the employers submit, we do anticipate to lose a few. As Peter says, we're not in the business of you know, trying to create a really small club here. We want to have a big club. So we'd hope we really don't lose that many, but you know, we could well lose a few. I can't hear you actually.
Sorry, forgot to unmute. A question that's come in from the audience. You mentioned that you have the 3 levels in the Good Work Standard in London. Is there a time limit for how long employers can spend in that foundation category when they're just adhering to the law? Really, you know, do they ever get pushed up?
So we're slightly different to Greater Manchester in that foundation level is really a stage that they need to go through in their self-assessment. So we're not congratulating anyone for being at that sort of foundation level, but we do want them to take a look and reassure themselves that they're meeting all of those basic and legal requirements. What we do have is a Good Work Standard community. So these are employers who've said that they're interested in good work. They get invited to our events. We communicate with them regularly on the themes of good work. And, you know, there's no time limit to that. They're not announced publicly or anything like that. So that really is an engagement tool for us to keep nudging and pushing good work. So we're set up slightly different to Greater Manchester. I think this idea of the time limit is relevant there. So you might want to, I don't know, others might be able to comment on that.
Thanks, Rachel. There's another question been posted from the audience asking if any employers have been stripped of the charter after falling below what they promised. My colleague Jay posted some information in the chat about this happening in Greater Manchester. I can't remember off the top of my head the details, but it did happen. Jay, I don't know whether you're able to share any more about that, about maybe did they come off the charter permanently, or was it a temporary removal, that kind of thing. I just want to, there's one more question we've had sent in before I ask everyone to wrap up. So I think this one, I think it might go to Peter Irwin because it's talking specifically about local authorities and social care. But if anyone else has got any comments, feel free to tell me. So the question asks that in some local areas, authorities are asking employers to sign up to charters before being awarded social care contracts. How can this person get their local authority to do the same?
Okay. Well, that sounds very good. I know in Greater Manchester that, because Greater Manchester is also a living wage city region, it's got that initiative as well. the charter's not the only game in town, really. But as a consequence of that, an agreement was secured from, or a commitment was secured from all the Greater Manchester local authorities to ensure that their commissioned social care workers would be paid at least the living wage. There was that. But it was interesting that it was the living wage part that we managed to get through. It wasn't that the organisations who would be commissioned would all have to be members of the employment charter. Because in truth, it is difficult for care organisations to reach the GM membership standard. And I haven't been around for the last year. I'm working nationally now, but certainly as of at the start of the year, there weren't any care providers that were members of the GM charter. But I think the question was about how would you go about trying to get it from your council. I think it's difficult. I mean, something we have done in Greater Manchester is we've got the combined authority to use some of the charter membership criteria in its own procurement policy now. We had a bit of an issue with that. Initially, they were only referencing the supporter tier, the lower tier in the GM charter, but they've gone further now, and they've got in the contract compliance area, they'll now require in the fulfilment of contracts that some of the membership criteria will be met. So not just the living wage, but also stuff around union access, around sick pay, around 0 hours contracts as well. So there's some good stuff in there, but that's only the combined authorities procurement policy. It's not the councils. So in order to extend what we've got in GM in regards to the councils being committed to the living wage to aspects of the membership criteria, I think that's probably the way to go, is if we could get councils to do the same thing the combined authority has done. So that's a very specific example. It depends where you live, really, and whether you've got a charter in place, whether it's one that's amenable to care providers meeting the standard for. I mean, it's difficult to think what the easy steps are to achieving that, but it's a good aim to have, I think.
So that nicely leads me on to my final two questions, which I'm going to put to all of you. We've already established that there's no sort of central database for charters. So do you think there is work needed to bring that on side for reps so that they have got somewhere to look? And once we have an agreed set of standards, that these could be common throughout all of these charters throughout the country, so that we don't have different things in every area. I'll put that final question to Peter Dickinson first, and then we'll finish after this.
I think that, as I've said, there's a lot of similarity, but also key differences between the different areas, and I think the role of those consultations in each of the areas is important, that all the different groups of stakeholders get their buy-in and they end up with a charter that's appropriate to their local area. I think the cross-combined authority working has developed charters that are quite similar between the two areas, but I think it's really important that they reflect what happens within their local areas. So I think you need to maintain those differences and nuances, but also the cross-authority working.
Thanks, Peter. Rachel, any thoughts on that final couple of questions, that final set of questions?
Yes, we're extremely grateful to the opportunity to share learning. So we do that at an officer level, and actually they do it at a political level too. But sessions like this, where we can share what's going on across the country, are hugely valuable, and also sessions that have been recently hosted by our academic institutions have been great. I agree. I think there's a really helpful similarity and comparability across the schemes, but actually what we're trying to do is support our local economies to reflect to the particular challenges. So some nuances I think feels right to me. I mean, what we have heard clearly from employers is that they'd like, if they're a good employer and they're operating across the country, they'd like their accreditation in Manchester to help them to be recognised, to perhaps have some aspect of transferability to their submission in London. That makes total sense. That's just a sort of practical, pragmatic thing. But yes, hopefully, have I addressed both of your points there, Anna? Can't remember if there was.
I think so.
Question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think we
you.
have. Any final thoughts, Peter Irwin, before I close?
Just on this whole issue of sort of passporting and consistency or not. I mean, I recall that there was a suggestion that the employment charter should become an employment charter for the whole North, should cover all the combined authority areas in the North. But I was always really sceptical about that because there's no politician elected to by an electorate across the whole of the North. So I think that democratic electoral link is really important. There is a figurehead, at least, who's associated with these charters, and somebody who people can choose to vote for or not, depending on what they think of the charter. So I think breaking that democratic link would be a big mistake. So I don't want a charter for the North. I'm happy with differences in different places. There can't be a race to the bottom with people trying to undercut each other. But what Rachel suggested around transferability, whereby if you say you got the GM accreditation, then that's good for 80% in Liverpool, but there's a couple of other things they want in Liverpool as well. Then I think that's fine. It should reflect what Peter's described around the nuances locally and what local people want ultimately from their employment.
Thank you so much for that to finish. We've come to the end of the webinar now. We've gone for very nearly an hour. So all that remains for me to do is to thank you all for joining. You've been a really good audience. There's some really insightful comments and good questions. Thank you to Peter, Rachel and Peter for joining me again today. And I've learned loads. I hope you all have as well. See you again soon for more from TUC Education webinars. Bye-bye for now.